Hey, all right. I'm getting a little delay here between audio and video. Let's see if that evens out. So today I want to talk to you guys a little bit. This is going to make me crazy. A little bit about the Nevada legislature. All right. So one, right, help to think about it comparatively. Compared to the U.S. Congress, what does the Nevada legislature look like? Well, like the U.S. Congress, it is bicameral. We have an assembly and we have a state senate. The assembly is akin to the House of Reps. The state senate is akin to the U.S. Senate. All right, so we have an upper chamber and a lower chamber. Assembly is much larger. The state senate is much smaller. Terms of service in the assembly, 2 years, like in the House of Reps. Term of service in the state senate, 4 years. Right, which is kind of like the Senate, but not quite. Right, the Senate, U.S. Senate, is 6 years. Nevada State Senate, 4 years. I think that's common, maybe even universal in all 50 states, except maybe Nebraska, which has a weird unicameral system. Not so sure about them. And unlike the U.S. Congress, the Nevada legislature does have term limits, like many state legislatures do. You can serve a maximum of 12 years in each chamber. Technically, one could imagine somebody serving 12 years in the assembly and then running for a state senate seat and serving another 12 years. That's at least theoretically possible. So yeah, we've imposed those sorts of term limits. That would be what? 2-year terms in the assembly would mean 6-term limit in the assembly. 4-year terms in the Senate would be a 3-term limit. I think my math is right there. All right, so we do have term limits. And there's a pro and con about that. I explore that a bit more, I think, in the slides and in the notes. I'm not a huge fan of term limits myself, but that's just me. I think there's too much lost and too little gained. To me, bottom line, we the people, right? We have the power, Luke. We just have to use it. If we don't like a veteran legislator, vote the person out, you know? So to me, term limits says we don't trust we the people to make good decisions. Sometimes, honestly, you want to keep somebody in because they're so good. To get rid of them mindlessly, to me, not smart. But again, that's me. There's pro and con there. Check it out. The U.S. Congress, right, does not have term limits. Some states tried to impose those many years ago, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, because Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution does not anticipate term limits. So that's a difference between the Nevada legislature and the U.S. Congress. Another difference is the Nevada legislature is very much part-time, right? At least technically, they only meet 4 months every 2 years. 120 calendar days every 2 years. So they're meeting right now, right up in Carson City, working on that biennial budget that will run from July of 2021 to July of 2023. Yeah. And other legal stuff, laws that they'll be looking to pass and so forth. Now that being said, there's become quite a tradition now of the governor calling special sessions pretty regularly, like this past summer to fix the pandemic budget shortfall for the second year of that previous biennial budget cycle. So they actually meet more than 4 months every 2 years, but it's hard to pin a number on that because it depends sort of on circumstances and when special sessions are called and for how long. When Sandoval had negotiated that deal to get the Raiders to move from Oakland to Las Vegas, he had to call the legislature into special session to debate the package of tax incentives that he had negotiated. Same thing when he negotiated a deal with Tesla. Had to call the legislature into session to review that deal. Also true, by the way, I know some state legislators, it's also true that they don't only work 4 months up in Carson City. They do a lot of work before that, back in their home districts, getting ready for that session. And then there's always stuff to do after it's over. So, yeah. like many political scientists, I think we should have a full-time legislature that's paid well, that meets every year for maybe 4 or 5 months. But, you know, we have that sort of Wild West libertarian tradition that's made that unpopular with most people. And that's who gets to decide, right, and rightly so, as we the people of Nevada. They're also, very poorly paid, by the way, very poorly paid. I forget what it is. It's a few $1,000s for 2 years of service. 4 months every 2 years. Plus they get per diem when they're up in Carson City. I think about $100 a day per diem for food and expenses and lodging. So if you're looking to make money, do not try to run for the legislature in Nevada. You'll make almost no money. That's an issue, by the way. Yeah, it raises the question of who is in a position to make almost no money. And a lot of people can't afford to do that, right? Because it's treated as kind of a part-time job at best. So who's in a position to do that? People who are independently wealthy, people whose spouse makes good money, people who are business owners maybe who have some flexibility, attorneys who are maybe with a law firm that sees that as advantageous for the firm long term, so they support that. Maybe you have your own law firm and you do it because you can make good connections. Let's not kid ourselves, right? You can do a lot of good if you're a business owner and or an attorney. You can make good connections up in Carson City, and quite honestly, help your career quite a bit. So that's probably the most common sort of class of those who end up serving. Is they are either an attorney or a business owner, because you can be both, right? And then they do it as a way to sort of advance their career long term, and they can afford to do it then. But if you're trying to make a living doing this, straight up just the money, hell no, my God. You end up, you could easily be, if that's all you did and you didn't have a spouse that made money, you'd be homeless. You would be homeless. You could, maybe afford a tent in the desert. So I question that. Unlike Congress, right, where if you serve in the U.S. Congress, you make decent money, and it's full time and it's professionalized. Let's see. I have 2 former students currently in the legislature, Howard Watts and Sandra Ioregi, although I think I'm badly mispronouncing her name. I also have a former student who served on the Clark County Commission. Pretty cool. Okay. To overcome a gubernatorial veto, you need 2/3 in both chambers. That rarely happens. Governors in Nevada rarely veto, and when they do, they typically are successful with that veto. That's very similar to how the U.S. Congress works with the president, right? But to pass a tax increase, this really bugs me. To pass a tax increase in Nevada, you need 2/3 in both chambers. It was a dumbass rule, in my humble opinion, passed when that disaster of a guy was our governor, Jim Gibbons, who was in over his head. It was passed under his leadership, if you can call that what he did leadership. And now we're stuck with it. I think it's dumb. Right? There's no other sort of law or anything else that the legislature does that requires 2/3 in both chambers. Only tax increases. Right? It's sort of a visceral, naked desire to limit tax increases. Let's add a special rule of supermajority in both chambers. On principle, you really can't defend that, other than I really hate taxes, but that's really not sort of a high principle. That's a low policy desire. Should, to me, be like every other policy, 50% plus one, but again, it is what it is. So we know now that the legislature, Democrats do not have 2/3 in both chambers, in either chamber. So that means the tax increases is probably off the table. Not that Democrats were even going to look to do that. They might have. I don't know. But they certainly won't have. Okay. The governor tends to dominate the biennial budget process because the governor, right, is on the job 12 months out of the year. So So, and the governor has a staff to work on the budget throughout the year. So the governor comes in basically with a proposed budget and then pitches that to the legislature, who then responds to that proposal. That's kind of how it works in Washington, D.C. as well, by the way. So nothing radical about that. But the governor does tend to dominate the budget process here in Nevada. Even though the governor does not have the line item veto, many governors do. Not the U.S. president, but many governors do. Let's see. The Nevada legislature has been party competitive over the decades. That's the big picture. Okay. And even recently as 2016, Republicans controlled both chambers of the State House. Okay, so you don't have to go back far to find Republicans winning in the legislature here. So people think we're a deep blue state. We're manifestly not that. I think we're purple and maybe slightly blue, maybe. So I think the reports of the demise of the Nevada GOP have been greatly exaggerated. All right. Now look, in 2016, Democrats won back both chambers. Right. So by January of 2017, they were back in control. 2019, 2016, 2018, the 2018 cycle, they won big, gained big majorities in both chambers. I think they had 2/3 in the Assembly, and they were one vote shy of that in the Senate. And then here in November of 2020, Republicans won back 3 seats in the Assembly, and they won back 1 seat in the Senate. So look, Democrats are still in control with healthy majorities in both chambers, but they don't have super majorities in either chamber. And Republicans had a really good cycle. And honestly, if I'm looking at 2022, which is likely to be a tough one for Democrats because Democrats control the White House, because typically there's a backlash after the first 2 years of a new president against that president's party. I don't think it's insane to imagine that Nevada Republicans could conceivably win back either or both of those chambers. I think that's going to be on the menu. I don't know that they can pull it off, but it wouldn't shock me. It would not. And then, quite honestly, I think Sisolak is hardly a lock to get reelected in 2022. Hardly. I think he's actually going to be pretty vulnerable depending on who Republicans run. So could we, by January of 2023, be looking at a Republican governor and a Republican legislature? Absolutely. It's a real possibility. Nevada's still pretty damn competitive. Remember, Biden did win Nevada over Trump, but by a very small margin. Likewise with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Women have now, for a couple cycles, been in the majority in the legislature. That's pretty cool. We're the first state to achieve that in both chambers and in the aggregate. Both chambers combined, majority female. That's quite remarkable. Although again, if I'm being critical here, I would say part of that reason is that it's a part-time job that pays almost nothing. I think it's created a little space, quite honestly, for women to win a majority of those seats. It's still a great thing, don't get me wrong, but I do think that may be part of the calculus. Like in Congress, don't underestimate the very great significance of party leadership in both chambers. So if you want to see where the real power is in the Nevada legislature, look at who the Senate Majority Leader is, Senate Majority Whip, Senate Minority Leader, Senate Minority Whip, Assembly Majority Leader, Assembly Majority Whip, Assembly Minority Leader, Assembly Minority Whip. Those are the top 2 positions within each party in each chamber, and they're the ones making the key decisions about what to do about the budget and what to do about legislation, with significant input from rank and file members as well. But leadership, like in Congress, they have disproportionate power. That's the way parties work and legislatures work. Redistricting, that's going to be on the menu, right? every 10 years after a census. Now that census data has been delayed because of the pandemic. So it's going to be interesting to see when those numbers finally come in and how much time there's left to work on it. And that might be right there if they don't. They started meeting in February, so February, March, April, May. If those numbers come in late enough, the governor might need to call a special session in the summer just to work on redistricting, redrawing those boundaries for both Congress and the state legislature. Democrats will control that process, right? They'll control that process. It's decided by the legislature in negotiation with the governor. Democrats control both the legislature and the governor's mansion. So they're going to be looking, quite honestly, to draw lines that are favorable to the Democratic Party. So right now, what's at stake? The 2022 election cycle is what's at stake. The 2024 election cycle, the 26 to 28, and the 2030 election cycle. That's what's at stake. Right? These lines will hold until 2031. So the next several election cycles will be run using the lines that are being created right now up in Carson City, when that census data comes in. So that'll give Democrats a nice edge for the next 10 years. So right now, Democrats control 3 out of the 4 congressional seats, although you kind of expect that. But at times it's been 2-2. So Democrats will be trying to keep 3 out of the 4 in terms of how they draw those lines. And they'll be trying to create lines for both the Senate and the Assembly that are as advantageous as possible for Democrats. Now look, Nevada is a relatively lightly populated state. Almost all the population is in Clark County here in southern Nevada. So typically there's not a ton of room to be really creative with line drawing. That's sort of a natural boundary on how much hanky-panky goes on with redistricting. But there's a little room. Okay. And then finally, this past summer of 2020, Sisolak did call the legislature into special session to work on the second year of the last biennial budget. Remember how I said, right? Because the legislature only meets once every 2 years. Each time they meet, they have to do a 2-year budget cycle. And by the time you get to the second year of that cycle, often things are off a bit, either in terms of revenue or spending or both. That's what happened here, right? We got less revenue than we had expected because of the pandemic. And spending was going up because of unemployment and so forth. So they had to meet in, I think it was July. And, they put into place some pretty significant cuts, right? To cover that shortfall in revenue because of the pandemic and its impact on our economy. And I had been anticipating an even worse budget cycle starting now for July of 21 to July of 23, which is the fiscal year budget cycle. But if you've been out at all in the last week or two, wow, the Las Vegas economy at least is certainly opening back up again, and unemployment's dropping pretty quickly. So when the bureau that does that produces the numbers for the legislature, what they think the economy will look like, and therefore revenues in the next 2 years, is actually pretty favorable. Looks pretty good, pretty solid. And then in addition to that, right, Congress passed that almost $2 trillion stimulus bill, with a big chunk of that going to state and local governments to help them with their budgets. Wow. Something that Republicans had opposed, right? And I understand why. So quite honestly, that biennial budget that I thought was going to be harsh is not going to be harsh at all. In fact, I think they're reversing some of the cuts they made in July, because revenues have been better than expected, and they got money from Congress. So, yeah. That caught me by surprise, by pleasant surprise. That's been a real positive here. I'm sure the legislators and the governor are like, woo, right? Because neither of those like to enact draconian cuts in spending, because it makes constituents unhappy, right? So they're going to avoid that. So they are super excited. I'm kind of excited. All right, I'm going to hit this under 20 minutes. I'm going to stop right now. Thanks all, and that's what you need to know.